Thank you very much. Everything I'm going to show you here in terms of graphics, illustrations, all bespoke, done by artists at Throughline. They're not only in the book, they're going to be on my Substack in JPEG and PDF form tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. So you can get the whole brief off the web. I'm presenting my bottom line up front. I retitled it as this century's OODA loop because it's kind of my way of thinking through what I think is the process of this century. Okay, and I'm really aiming for chapter headings in a 22nd century history of the 21st century, where I don't believe Ukraine is going to have an entire chapter, where I don't believe Taiwan's going to have an entire chapter. I think other things are going to be much more salient, much more dominating, much more world-shaping. So my story begins with US-style globalization, born of American ambition and frustration after what seemed like almost consecutive world wars. We decided to take our internal rule set of how we traded and interacted and invested and transacted with each other at very high speed with great freedom inside our 50 member states and projected that across the world. 3 huge outcomes. First, the great acceleration of human consumption and activity, so the mother of all externalities. Second, the price of admission, undergoing a demographic transition which is changing the North very dramatically right now. And then third, the prize, the birthing of a majority global middle class, foretold by no one, and yet there it is. My argument, it's the greatest accomplishment any one country has ever enabled for the planet. But huge consequences result, okay? Any one of these 3 would define a new global order in my mind. All 3 are happening at the same time. They come together to compel, in my argument, North-South integration going forward. So the world that we've lived in, very East-West, now becomes North-South. Why? Climate change devastates lower latitudes more than higher latitudes. Demographic transition unequal, also by latitude. And that majority global middle class that we're adding are going to be found overwhelmingly within those lower latitudes being subjected to decimation by climate change. 2 fellow traveler dynamics. 1, a regionalization imperative that comes about quite naturally in globalization because Asia basically tops out as a cheap labor market in the form of China. So it no longer makes sense to send everything there and bring it all the way back. So re-regionalization makes a lot of sense. Simultaneously, there is an ongoing, emerging superpower brand competition for those 3 billion new middle classnicks going to be added next 25, 30 years. And the reason why DEI and ESG makes sense is because that 3 billion is going to be almost exclusively non-white, non-European, non-American, non-Christian, non-Western. So if you can't understand that pool, you're going to be shut out of the big prize this century. This is a 50-year perspective, my OODA loop. All this basically works out by around 2075. To wit, we top out as a species at 10.4 billion. Climate change, largely baked in. Nothing we're going to do now is going to change the next 4 or 5 decades, much at all. We're really arguing about the 22nd century. So I'm talking about a zone of turbulence that forces accelerated evolutions. Scientists will tell us that species the world over are being asked to evolve at 10,000 times normal speed, which is a lot. Most of them are going to fail. That's why we're living through the 6th great mass extinction era in planetary history. Because all species have 3 choices: adapt, move, or die. And most are going to die. 2 to 3 times faster normal speed gets you political revolutions. So the idea that we're going to look the same, have the same sort of international structure, same sort of enterprise system, same sort of capitalism, all that's going to get dramatically stressed and altered over the next 4 or 5 decades. So I'll tell my story in 6 parts. First, this notion that America begat modern globalization, unleashed it upon the world. It did amazing things. It altered the planet. It got so big and so powerful, it started to impact us more than we could impact it. As recently as 10, 15 years ago, when people talked about globalization, they said it's westernization, or worse, Americanization. Nobody calls it that anymore. Nobody. And that's what gets us the kind of political reaction we've had going back to the Tea Party in 2010. Globalization is this monster that we no longer control. And it becomes our punching bag for everything we don't like about our world. Here's my favorite map of the United States. It gets updated every so often online. Countries matched to US states with the same GDP, and the delta noted there is population size. India has the same GDP as California, 5th biggest economy in the world. It takes them 36 times more people to achieve that. That's what the rest of the map looks like. You add it up, it's almost 2.5 billion souls. So how did we make all that economic activity happen between 330 million people? An almost absolute free reign to trade and invest and move and transact and throw money and technology all over the place. We built an international system on rules. Globalization comes with rules, but not a ruler. It took us a while to admit that. And frankly, we're fairly pissed off about it now. We sought very purposefully to create a multipolar system within which countries would rise peacefully. We have in East Asia now a strong Japan, a strong Korea, a strong India, a strong China. That's never been achieved before in human history. Is it tenser than it used to be? Sure. But that's an amazing achievement. So we wanted this multipolarity, and now that we got it, we don't like it so much. We don't even like the institutions we created to create the multipolarity. We're constantly pulling out. Second point, climate is going to change everything. That notion of an east-west world going to a north-south world. Think back to your Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, Steel. This is his version of the map. And what he said was basically the wide parts of the world beat the tall parts of the world. Because of all that environmental sameness across that vast Eurasian landmass, you figure something out in that belt, it works everywhere. So diffusion allows for advanced civilizational development. Elsewhere, much harder because the bands are much narrower. So up to this point in history, it made sense to be wide. Wide beat tall. Climate change alters that, flips it on its head. If you think about it, lower latitudes, who's got lots of lower latitudes? Over here. Whereas our neck of the woods, that's a fairly thin slice for us, not that many people. Our continents stretch all the way to both poles. So less exposure, more relief factor built in. This is why I view the world now largely in vertical terms, as I say. I talk about a western vertical, talk about a center vertical, I talk about an eastern vertical. Climate change is going to decimate, literally, between the horse latitudes north and south, 30 degrees north and south, are going to experience progressively more each year, just like Phoenix registered 100 days in a row, 100 degrees above temperature. It's building up each year. they're going to experience the equivalent of the Saharan desert in terms of average temperature and precipitation range. If you ever see pictures of the Saharan desert at night, it's pretty dark because not many people live there because it's a really hard place to live. That band, I dub it Middle Earth, is going to come under immense stress. Species the world over have been migrating up in elevation, a couple of meters every year, a couple of kilometers towards the pole every year, systematically all over the world. Everything's on the move. So when I say decimate, I'm saying 10% to Australia's worth of good, livable, arable land is going to disappear across Middle Earth next 4 or 5 decades. Going to disappear. That's what 80% of our population is, and 80% of that population lives on the land, lives off the land. And they're going to get kicked off the land in vast numbers. It will be, just so happens, that the new North will be gifted roughly 2 Australia's worth of arable, livable land. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Those responsible for climate change benefit. Those not responsible for climate change unduly penalized. So let's game out the immigration problem or the migration problem that happens, because I'm going to argue there's 2 types of people in this future. Those put on the move by climate change and those forced to accept or deal with those put on the move by climate change. North versus South perspective. In the North, we view it in terms of cost. In the South, they view it in terms of risk, translated into need, translated into desperation. The goal is obvious. Limit impact across Middle Earth, boost resilience as much as you can, keep as many people there as you can, while accommodating the flow that results. Traditional approach, official development aid, assistance, OODA, typically too little. Foreign direct investment, FDI, typically too late. FDI likes certainty, and Middle Earth isn't going to feature a lot of certainty. There's going to be state failure throughout Middle Earth. A lot of these countries are already teetering in terms of their governance capacity. They will be viewed by the North increasingly as threats, if only for sending those migrants, which we already demonize quite openly, poisoning our blood, vermin, all that kind of good stuff. The question for your average migrant is, do I stay or do I go? I leave the land. You'll hear this story and news story after news story. I leave the land. Maybe I leave my wife and kids. Certainly leave my parents behind. I go to the city. I try to work. That only works for so long. I make the march towards the free movement areas in the North, and I send back money through remittances. So who's left behind? The poor and the elderly. And that's actually happening inside the United States in places like Arizona, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, because we're starting to see that in terms of the hurricane responses. So most are going to go to the city, then they're going to go to the next country over, and when they get really desperate, they're going to march through the Darien Gap, come 1,000 miles north, and then they're our problem. We either resettle, we have a long history of that. Hell, Lincoln gave away about 10% of America one year. Said, come on over, all you German farmers, start farming. There's 40 acres. Canada did very similar things. So we know how to do this in the North. We also know how to repel. The Saudis were caught killing about 1,000 Ethiopian migrants coming across the border from Yemen. They bury them right there on the spot in mass graves, very Einsatzgruppen, Poland, 1940. The Italian Coast Guard, if you remember, let a ship go down with 250 in the Med. The Washington Post caught the EU having sent €500 million to North African countries to grab migrants as they're coming through, take them out in the middle of the Saharan desert, and dump them. So the killing's already begun. The question is, how bad is it going to get, and who are you going to get to do the killing for you? My argument, you need a whole of government soft power response. Ultimately, you're going to offer accession tracts to those Middle Earth nations, to membership status in larger North-South unions of various designs. The EU is a good model for how it's gone from West Europe to East Europe. Why do you do that? You create the legal certainty that attracts the FDI. You extend security networks. You maximize the staying population. And frankly, you realize everybody's got their own problem set. China's not going to care about beggaring our neighbors throughout Central and Latin America, because when they get desperate, they're not going to China. They're coming to us. And frankly, we don't care about the Africans coming across the Med to Europe. That's not our problem. So everybody's going to deal with the pain they feel most closely associated with their borders. Now a quick bit on demographics. The key notion here is this is a one-way street. This is how you join global value chains, but it's a one-way street. This is the classic representation of a demographic transition. High birth, high death on the left, underdeveloped, rural. Low birth, low death on the right, developed, urban. For movie buffs, on this side, it's mostly Soylent Green. We got so many people, we got to eat them. Go back and watch the movie 1973. They explained at the beginning, it's because of climate change. Also, it's in the year 2022, so be ready. Then, in my short lifetime, we go to not having too many people, but where did all the babies go? They're all gone. And if you look, it's only 5 years later, according to Hollywood. Seems incredible until you travel to Japan or Italy or South Korea, where they're begging people. China's now begging people to have babies. The transition from that unmodern to modern reality, that's the demographic transition. It's triggered when you move to the city and your babies start surviving at a higher rate. You don't need 10 kids. You only need 2 because they both make it on average. Takes a while for that to sink in. While it does take that while, a natural increase is birthed. At first, it's a baby boom. Everybody loves babies. Then it's a youth bulge. Oh my God, what are we going to do with all these teenagers? America, 1960s. Then it's a demographic dividend. We got to cash in while we can, because eventually you start looking like Japanese. This is a traditional age pyramid, so named because it's a pyramid shape. Lots of babies, lose them all the way through life. Why? You get farther up the chain and eventually packs of wolves hunt you down as you get slower and more infirm. And the herd is thinned. Unless you're human and you live above nature, then you do what you want. This is a youth bulge forming. South Korea, 75. This is the desired diamond shape. Man, you better be attracting foreign direct investment right then. America cheats at this. America constantly brings in people within that middle range to kind of fill itself out and maintain a quasi-permanent demographic dividend. And what do? In thank you for these people, we call them vermin and rats, and we accuse them of poisoning our blood and being rapists and criminals because we're ignorant and we're scared. And it's good salesmanship. This is what nobody knows, this future. It is a wildly spinning top. Good luck keeping that thing balanced, either with robots or lots of immigrants. I will tell you, this is the history of globalization. America, demographically unharmed by the Second World War, has a baby boom. We're going to rule the world forever. 50s and 60s, Mad Men. Until the Japanese have a 3-decade-long baby boom, And then they're going to rule the world. Japanese are taking over completely. When I joined the Pentagon in 1990, they were like, read Michael Crichton, Rising Sun, we're going to war with the Japanese. And then they got a little bit old, and that was that. Then China comes along, 400 million. They're going to rule forever. They figured out capitalism in some way nobody can understand, except they top out. 2010, wages start to rise. Everything starts moving to Southeast Asia, the big decoupling. Well, the Chinese firms are moving there too. Then they're going to move to India, 500 million. Beyond that, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, about 1 billion souls. Mid-century, 1 out of 4 humans will be African. Half of them will be under age 25. There's your history of globalization. It's not great men, it's not great policies, it's mostly demographics. Chase the cheapest labor pool. Now let's talk about that global middle class. It was only about 2 billion back in 2000. It's about 4 billion now. It'll be about 6 billion in the year 2050. That is a lot of cheese. That is a lot of big data. That is a lot of connectivity. That's a lot of information, networks. China, supremely interested, as we heard earlier, in colonizing that sort of world with its own information technology ecosystems. Climate change is going to create a lot of geopolitical orphans. So will rising competition among the main superpowers. America, as we clearly voted yesterday, is all in it, all for itself going forward. We're no longer the market maker. We are the ruthless market player. And we're going to get a lot of ruthless market playing tossed in our faces over the next 3-4 years, because the rest of the world's pretty damn competitive at this point. So think about geopolitical orphans, climate migrants, failed states. Contemplate the notion of free agency, or as I like to say, urgency creates agency. Think about these 5 major franchises and ask yourself, in that competition, who gets bigger and who gets smaller? Who grows and who gets dismembered? The Europeans have a model that they've been using very successfully for the last 30, 40 years. It is so successful that Russia has to invade countries along its border to stop that country from joining the EU and NATO. That's how successful it is. They've been growing throughout. The Russians have a model. It's very 19th century. They basically go across the border and they take hostages. Then they freeze the conflict until you get bored, and then they take some more about 5, 6 years later. And they've been really busy at it. It's crude, but effective. So that's Europe. That's Russia. Now let's talk about the United States and China. Much depends on how you view the game board. The United States prefers the mercantile nature of poker. How bad do you want that pot? We like showdowns. We like bluffs. So you've seen it in Ukraine for the last 2 years. We put down a new card every 3 to 4 months and say, do you want to raise? But of course, the Russians are playing chess. Putin has unlimited pawns, although he's starting to run out, so he's got to start buying his pawns from North Korea. Different meat, same wave tactics. And then you got the Chinese, who view the go board that is the international environment. And they are methodically laying stones all over the place. And each of those stones is a surveillance security system. It's a node in the BRI. And they are winning all over the place. And we think just because it's corrupt or it's a little environmentally damaging that somehow they're losing with this. They're not. Now, the Belt and Road makes tons of sense. As the last integrated into the global value chain system, China is the next up to integrate those who follow. It needs to move up the production ladder, slot in cheaper labor under it so we can all keep jumping up the chain. Right now, that's Southeast Asia. That will be India, without a doubt, next 3-4 decades. Beyond that, Africa. But China plays a very sophisticated game. It's not just the Belt and Road. They say, you know, I know you want in on 5G. I know you want in on stuff. Here's a ton of Huawei phones. Here's all the routers you could possibly use. We'll install it all. We'll charge you almost nothing, but we will have backdoors into everything. And if we have trouble with people inside your country, we'll go ahead and arrest them on that basis through our secret police stations that we sprout up inside your country without asking permission. That's the level of Chinese paranoia about maintaining Communist Party rule. Their Minority Report extends across the planet. But why am I not talking about Taiwan? That is the one we should all be jacked about. I mean, I got the calendar invite like last week, and I said yes. It's March 2027, it turns out. Because we're convinced that one hand of poker with China is for all the chips. We get China, then we win. What if grand strategy isn't about grabbing huge chunks of land? What if it's about something else? That something else is being forced upon us, I would argue, by an early arrival of the singularity in the military realm. As AI, cyber, drones, robots get more and more useful, and as the presence of actual forces become more and more vulnerable, the Ukrainians specialize in killing Russians when they muster in two lines. They track their signals and just send drones and kill them while they're mustering. Or the 3 Americans who bought it in North Jordan got it in their bunks. So 3 on a match is now 3 minutes on TikTok. They can find you and they can kill you. The Russians had to move their Black Sea fleet all the way to the other side of the Black Sea. And now the Ukrainians, 5-6 hours ago, announced that they were attacking naval facilities on the far side of the Black Sea with drones. So it's becoming too dangerous for tanks in the battle space, too dangerous for military in general. And when you get to a certain point, you reach that military singularity, you go to a different kind of reality forced by the supreme asymmetry that's been referenced. Can I take out a $50 million capital ship with a $100,000 missile? Yeah, I can do it all day long. When I worked for Art Zabrowski, Office Force Transformation, our joke was sort of like the many, the proud, few, the proud, the Marines. We'd say, the future of the military is the many, the disposable, the cheap, the unmanned. Okay? Visionary at the time, pretty much how it's going now. So we're leaving behind human-centric warfare. You may have seen this snuff film online. It's got great heavy metal soundtrack to it. Drone comes over to this guy, looks at him and says basically, it's your turn. Guy points to his comrades about 200 yards to the left. They go over, kill the comrades, then they come back. This poor soul hasn't figured out anything better in the meantime, and so he begs before they kill him. A post-human battle space. It's no longer the ability to capture and defend territory. We're stuck in World War I-like stalemates. All I can do is prevent you from getting it. All you can do is prevent me from getting it. All we can do collectively is throw robots at each other all day long. You've noticed how Indo-Pacific Command, 2 years ago, talking about Marines hopping and World War II all over again, now they talk about a drone hellscape. That's how quickly it's changed to a post-human battle space where your industrial complex is a couple of 20-somethings with laptops in the middle of a field in Ukraine putting out a $600 drone. Right now, half the deaths in Ukraine are drone affected. A couple of years, it'll probably be 100%. So what's left? What's left is the cyber terror battle space. And that's where China's approach is very interesting. So again, what if grand strategy wasn't about capturing the heartland or some fulcrum of Europe, but what if it was about capturing individuals? You would operate subnationally, transnationally. You would access their identity, you'd split it, you'd transmute allegiances. You do it simply by getting control of their information choke point, their smartphone. On that basis, you get to monitor and gather big data on how they speak with everybody, how they transact with the world, what media they take in, and on that basis, you can shape their ideological worldview. You have captured them in a matrix of your making, an information ecosystem you control. Now, Amazon wants to do this, so does Apple, okay? They all want to do it, but they have to compete in our networks. In China, it's much different. So all that big data sucked out, turned in against itself, improving the predictive machinery of AI, and you are conditioning people like crazy. And yeah, the Chinese players across the spectrum do collaborate. It's all part of a big picture. Their goal, previewed by the social credit scoring system that's been tested and expanded throughout China, is basically to make you police yourself on the basis of your score. I got a friend who doesn't behave so well. I visited him yesterday. My score dropped. Now I don't get to go home for the holidays on train. Great Black Mirror episode called Nosedive. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's a funny version of this, but it's not so funny when you realize we're raising generations of younger people very vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. China's spreading this network technology all over the world. What about India? Can't we get India to help us to contain the Chinese? The answer is no, for the following reason. India is too important in and of itself. When the West got a middle class at the turn of the 20th century, we got responses from the left and we got responses from the right. And where democracy flourished was where it was made middle class centric. Okay, we got these packages now, and we call each other the same names. The question is, who represents the middle in this future? And I would argue outside of the EU, I'm not sure about America for a few years, but outside of the EU, the #1 champion for now is India. And how India makes that rise happen while remaining proudly a social welfare state is going to be a huge impact on the future of the global economy. Now I'm going to argue that despite all these scary things I've told you, it's all going to work out. That's because the West is the best. I'm going to give you a bunch of reasons. Long history of interstate peace. Like Arby's, we have the beef. In terms of expanding resource advantages, the Western Hemisphere is about 15% of the world's population, access to about 45% of potable water. Guess what happens when you have a lot more water than people? You have food left over. This is 60% of the calories consumed in the world. 5 major grains. There's what you grow. China's the biggest farming power in the world. There's what you eat. China's the biggest eating power in the world as well. There's what you import. China imports more than anybody else in terms of food. And then there's what's left over for export. For China, nothing. For the United States, Western Hemisphere in general, it's basically OPEC level dominance. 60 to 70%. Huge advantage. Think about the 20th century as the century in which we got this concept called petrodollars, which is just basically taking oil and turning it into financial power. And then ask yourself, what's the equivalent of a water dollar 21st century? Because people are making those plans now. In terms of nearshoring, 3 big demand manufacturing hubs, we are the least integrated. Our integration with Latin America is almost non-existent. I wonder why. If you fear the mixing of the races, and some people do, I will tell you, Amerindians, 90% wiped out when the colonials came, brought enslaved Africans, allowed Asian cheap labor starting in the 19th century. What we've seen since then is an intermixing of the major racial groups from the Eastern Hemisphere in the Western Hemisphere, to the point where whites are only 45% of the Western Hemisphere. Now, why would I bring that up? Well, America's on a demographic journey, a very rapid, unprecedented demographic journey, where we're heading to about 45% white. And I would argue most of the political polarization in our system finds its roots in the fears that generates. There's less diversity to manage in our neck of the woods. Pretty sure sign we were conquered by the Europeans, am I right? And then how about religious diversity? The eastern slice, complex, beyond my understanding. In the middle slice, you got Islam versus Christianity. In the western slice, since we were colonized, we were mostly converted. 80% Christian, 60% Catholic. Just so happens to be our Supreme Court. Not a coincidence. High latitude, who do we got? The Canadians, they're the best. Who do they got? The Russians, who frankly are the worst. And probably will come apart and be dismembered in this process because Russia doesn't actually have enough of a cultural, genetic, civilizational coherence to man that vast scale of land. Watch the Arctic Council. In terms of demographic median age disparities, much easier for us to pull from Latin America. It's not such a huge gap. In terms of political match, we're actually quite democratic in the Western Hemisphere. The biggest problem, America's drug habit, and the fact that it creates all this corruption and violence throughout the region, with us supplying the guns, which is nice when you think about it. We supply the guns and the money, and they send the drugs. In terms of rivalrous superpowers, we don't have to deal with the Russians necessarily. We're going to test that prospect. And then in the East, it's the Chinese who have to worry about India's rise. There's nobody in our neck of the woods. That's how dominant we are. Finally, we got the most attractive national brand in the world. It's in many ways disgusting and loud and inescapable, but people love it the world over. We sell the world over, and they will do anything to come here. So let me wrap it up. I'm arguing for an America's first grand strategy. I'm going to make that argument on the basis of the process of elimination. If you think we're out integrating China and India across East Asia, I think you're high. It's not happening. And we can give Australia all the subs they want. It's still not going to change anything. Putin's done more to integrate Europe in 2 years than we did in about 5 decades. We're not going to do the Middle East anymore. There's too many players there already very ambitious to make that happen. It's overwhelmingly Asia's oil. Almost all of it goes to India and China. And the Persian Gulf monarchies are themselves incredibly ambitious and got a lot of money. That means all of those players are going into Africa. We're not, because we're frankly too far above the food chain for that to work for us. I mean, Walmart's there, but the rest of our economy, no. The one place in the world it makes sense is the one place in the world we treat like trash. And that's wrong. I'll be the first Barnett in 7 generations of Barnetts not to have a star added to my flag like all my predecessors did. There's no reason why we can't adopt the same mindset as the Europeans. Our national brand, access to our markets, those are the most important attributes we have, not our military. So I am arguing for more stars on the American flag because that's how we're going to socialize that latitudinal risk. The alternative, you know what it is. Shoot them at the border in large numbers. Deport them in the millions. We'll see how that goes. I'll take any questions if you'd like. I think the biggest problem in our system right now is that the boomers have not exited the stage in terms of their political leadership class, because the boomers as a political leadership class, like most generations, they know what they grew up with. So Russia, communist threat. China, communist threat. If you got a problem, you declare a Cold War. Then you contain them. If that doesn't work, World War III. So what do you hear every day? I get an alert from Google like every 32 seconds. World War III declared by such and such a general, by such and such a leader. Jamie Dimon wet his pants and screamed it last week. Until we get past the boomer generation and we start getting some natives, millennials, Gen Zs, who look at the world very differently, who are much more attuned to the demographic changes and the responsibilities that are going to be foisted upon them generationally, financially, and who are very cognizant of what climate change is going to do, okay? This is too much for most of them. It's not too much for the World Bank, not too much for the IMF. I can go into any European capital. They get all this like crazy. Farther away from Washington I am, smarter I become. Come here. They're like, I don't see Taiwan. I don't see Ukraine. I don't see my industrial complex in a way that makes sense to me. I just don't get this. You're an outlier. Go away. Let's extend all sorts of possibilities for Schengen zone-like inclusion or fiscal union-like inclusion or dollarized economy-like inclusion. You can create all sorts of packages. The Europeans have all those overlapping Venn diagrams. And on that basis, you're basically saying, hey, if you give me this effort on migration, I'll do this for you. I'll make this happen for you. I'll give you this status. I'll bring you this far in. And maybe in another 5 to 10 years, that's what it usually takes in the European Union, I'll make you a member state. Because ask yourself, if you're Honduras, do you think you're going to survive this by yourself? You're losing people like crazy because there's a mega drought there, the dry corridor, the bulk of the population. And so they're coming. It's not the Mexicans who are coming now. They're by and large doing well, largely integrated. We've extended enough belonging to Mexico for it to work through things like NAFTA and USMCA and all that kind of stuff. We need to extend all that stuff much further down and do it proactively, not because it makes us money right off the bat. Western Europe didn't make a lot of money off the bat by integrating Eastern Europe, but is it a much better situation now when Russian revanchism eventually reappears to be having that fight in Ukraine instead of Berlin? Yeah, it's a lot better. Plus, Europe is a bigger, stronger package. Such a huge force in terms of export market share for every region in the world that European rules basically dominate consumer products all over the world. And we're seeing that fight start to unfold on AI and IT and everything else, all the trust stuff that they're doing. So, I mean, that's real power in this future connected world. He who sets the rules tends to be he who buys the most in the system. Supply is global, demand is local. And demand's the real source of power. China's important because of what it consumes, not because of what it produces. We've been important largely because of what we consume and not produce for a while. It's an amazing power once you get there, because everybody caters to your needs. And that's one of the reasons why we're having such trouble with globalization now. Catering to the needs, it doesn't look like us anymore. So you got whites in America looking around this country going, I'm not comfortable. This is not the America I grew up in. Let's go back to the 1950s, make America great again. You also have an America that looks around the world and says, you know what, this isn't the globalization I set in motion. Okay, this is somebody else's globalization, and it's making me real nervous. So my answer is going to be tariffs. The perfect 21st century response to global economic connectivity. Tariffs. Well, we'll run that experiment, and it'll be a doozy. I think peak globalization that ran from about 1980 to 2008, which did unbelievable good all around the world, also set in motion an inequality function that's profound. And so the world in general, but especially the United States, is desperately in need of a progressive era, which we did back in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. We lucked out with the two Roosevelts, one Republican, one Democrat. We are just not there yet. We have all sorts of promises for that, but to date, neither party's really delivered. And we're going to try some really crazy stuff in the next 2 or 3 years, and we're going to get over that and learn those lessons. But ultimately, you got to regrade the economic landscape, especially as AI comes in and threatens all these things. You know, you got a world right now where South Korea is saying we should go to a 6-day work week. South Korea is pushing that. Other countries are saying we should go to like a 3-day work week. Are you kidding? Because AI is going to take care of this and that, you know. So we got these pressures and these tremendous collisions going on in the system, and we have tremendous answers coming at us in terms of technology. So that mid-century, the solution mix that comes about is going to really transform humanity profoundly. And it'll be our kids who are leading that effort, by and large. And by and large, I think we've educated them quite well for it. I know we think they're all stupid and lazy and, you know, but that's been true throughout human history going back about 5,000 years. The next generation's always full of idiots. And only we, the adults, can take care of things. And it's worse than that now. I actually asked Perplexity recently, how many middle-aged, straight, white males are there in the world? And it went, and it said about 1.9%. I said, wow, because when I read a history book, it's all middle-aged, straight, white males doing everything. They do everything. They win every battle, they lose every battle, they do everything. Nobody else is involved, nobody else. So of course they should get to rule forever on that basis, except they're not gonna.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. What an incredible way to close the day.